Hello, my name is Maria Vinogradova, and this is the second episode in my mini-series on this channel titled Steamrolled by Procedure. The channel tells the story of how we got locked out of our New York apartment for months following the death of Juliette, the woman to whom we sublet our apartment as we traveled out of country in summer 2025. We got locked out via a seal put on our door by the police and the Surrogate court, who never had a plan for how to get us back to our home. Instead, we had to fight to make this happen. The struggle is ongoing. Today, November 12th, 2025, we are still locked out while still continuing to pay rent. Today's episode focuses on Juliette, our subtenant. Juliette is her real first name, but I won't disclose her full identity because so much is still unclear about what's going to happen to her legacy. She died without a will, was not married, and did not have children. She had a vibrant circle of close friends, but what matters according to the law in such cases are blood relatives, which, in Juliette's case, are scarce and fairly distant. I am sure that Juliette's story will eventually be told in detail, just not right now and not by me. So I am intentionally leaving out some details and altering other names I am mentioning in this video. Juliette was a woman in her mid-50s. Parts of her childhood as well as adult life were spent in Canada and the United States, Montreal, Toronto, New York, and for a few years California, probably San Francisco, but maybe Los Angeles, not sure. Out of all these places, New York was where she ultimately spent the most time. She had a prominent career in tech. Earlier in her life, however, she had more of a pop cultural recognition in Canada. As I have learned more recently, those who know her from that stage are mostly unaware of her later career in tech. In April 2025, it was definitely time for myself and Dan, my husband, to get ready for the summer. That meant subletting our apartment that we rent from NYU Housing. Dan is a professor of cinema studies at New York University, and the university provides housing for its faculty. The university owns several large buildings in Greenwich Village, which the architecture buff in me really appreciates for their mid-20th century ideals manifested in their aesthetics, floor plans, and the overall environment. But as it's the case with affordable housing in New York, the maintenance is so-so. Not the worst, but at times you wonder if you're living in a student dorm. And then they have quaint features like mail chutes. It's a mail slot on your floor's common area. If you have a letter or a card to send, you put it into that slot and it descends to a room downstairs where the post officer will eventually collect and mail it. Not the most essential thing in the world, but it's pretty cool. The rent there is not cheap by my standards. It could be compared to, let's say, Utica Avenue in Brooklyn, or maybe Nostrand Avenue, meaning if you take the A train. But by Manhattan standards, it's dirt cheap. So anytime we post our apartment for a sublet via the university's website, we instantly get dozens of responses, with some people saying, "I'll pay the whole amount up front, and I don't even need to look at your place." Still, from those responses, we try to identify the kinds of people whom you could actually trust to leave your home and get it back in a livable condition. Our previous year's experience was excellent, so we weren't too worried. We had learned to pack our possessions in such a way as to leave an adequate amount of storage space to the subtenant and keep everyone happy. This year, as Dan was completing the sublet form online, he asked me, "Do we say yes or no to pets?" I said, "If it's a cat or a reasonably sized, well-behaved dog, why not?" He posted it in the evening, and the following morning there were 35 responses. "I'm a Harvard Business School student. I want your apartment for the entire period and I'll pay everything up front." Kind of expected. We've seen this before. Among these responses, there was one from a woman named Juliette with a dog named Tyra Banks. Juliette was interested, but she wanted to see the apartment first. We reasoned that someone who wants to see it before committing to living there for a few months is also likely the kind of person who cares enough about where she lives and that she'll be able to treat the place well and take care of our plans. We both teach, and this is a busy part of the semester. But we made some time to tame the mess that tends to accumulate at times when your most important commitments are outside the home, and made an appointment. It was a Friday, from what I remember. Before that, we had Googled her, plus her email signature included her website's address, so we studied it as well. What we saw were book publications and polished public appearances on YouTube. At one point, Dan said, "She may be too famous for us." I laughed and said, "Still, let's give it a try." Juliette was running very late, but eventually she showed up. A very tall woman in a short beige trench coat, she was smart-looking yet approachable. Not a diva, which, as I could gather, was what Dan had meant when he said she may be too famous. I asked her, "Would you mind taking off your shoes? It's the number one rule we follow at this house, and kindly ask others to observe. We would greatly appreciate this." Juliette said, "Of course, that's what I usually do as well." I had been secretly counting on her Canadian side to be good about this. In my experience, Canadians are better at this than their neighbors south of the border. As a Russian, I suffer greatly when street shoes are worn inside the house. Russians, as well as people in most or likely all post-Soviet countries, are almost Japanese about wearing, or rather not wearing, street shoes at home. Read unacceptable and unbearable. A decade and a half in America has not changed my mind about this. Juliette left hers right by the door, which was a good sign. We told her how much we loved Canada and how impressed we were on our road trip to the Gaspé Peninsula 2 years prior. She said she'd never visited Gaspé. She seemed to love everything about our apartment, and she was easy. We showed her the recycling bins, and she was very much on top of her recycling. We showed her our recently acquired cooking pots and pans, and she said she had similar ones, since this was the type she preferred. She seemed to be in a hurry. She was driving upstate for a weekend with a friend of friends. Yet, towards the end of her visit, she told us, "Can I be honest with you? Let's sit down." We both sat down on the couch, and she sat down in that upholstered chair so low that Dan has named it the Santa sleigh. She said, "My idea of renting this apartment is to have a vacation. I own a studio in Upper Midtown, but it's so tiny. I need more space. So renting a larger apartment is my idea of having a vacation." This was totally understandable, I told her. In fact, when I lived in Brooklyn with my ex, we considered buying an apartment. Yet real estate developers seem to have no shame. They convert a studio into a 2-bedroom, and floor plans are ridiculous. You end up living in an uncomfortable small place, and you're bound to it. Juliette totally understood what I was talking about. Our record collection caught her eye. We told her she was more than welcome to listen to our records if she felt like it. She said, "Are you serious? My ex-boyfriend never let me touch his records." Her sincerity was unusual for New York, yet very much in agreement with our own view of the world. We felt deeply satisfied, and leaving the apartment to her was easy. She definitely seemed like a better choice than the business school dudes willing to buy it all without looking. And we liked that a dog named Tyra Banks would be there with her. I left on April 24th, and Dan was to follow 2 weeks later. He met Juliette once more outdoors as she was walking Tyra Banks, so that she could hand him a check with the first month rent and security deposit. In May, after Dan had already joined me in Russia, we exchanged a few messages with Juliette, mostly on matters such as our Wi-Fi password and the best ways to stay in touch. We also asked her if she could keep an eye on a package from Germany, apparently lost by USPS, that we were still hoping to receive. Here is one of her first messages from May 22nd. "Hello, Dan and Maria. I've been quite sick in the last few days, so I won't be traveling next week. This is what my body does when I take a vacation. Travel is the main reason I didn't offer to check your mail. Next time I'm downstairs, I'll see if the German bulbs magically appear, say hello to Diane, and we'll bring up anything in your mailbox. If you need to speak, I'm on Signal and WhatsApp. If anything in the mail looks urgent, do you want me to photograph the envelopes? Warm regards, Juliette." On May 24th, Juliette wrote, "Hi Dan and Marie. She misspelled my name in that way. I'm in hospital before yesterday. Not know what is happening. Disowed. This confused, cryptic message was the last we heard from her. The last word, disowed, D-E-S-O-D-E, we had several versions for what it could mean, but we'll probably never know for sure. It was almost June and time to pay rent, but Juliette was silent. Dan was able to find her work partner, I'll call him Jeff, and get in touch with him. Jeff was in the same situation, trying to reach Juliette but not hearing from her. We were imagining every possible scenario except the worst. Did we misunderstand who she was? Was she actually one of those high-functioning people going forward despite serious mental illness and therefore could act erratically? As someone who had previously lived in shared housing arrangements in New York, I had definitely seen that. Sympathetic characters suddenly freaking out, creating chaos and then disappearing. This has happened to me. New York is full of all sorts of people. On June 2nd, Dan asked a neighbor to knock on our door and see if Juliette would respond. She did not. On June 3rd, when it was already daytime in Russia but still very early morning in the United States, Dan contacted our building and asked to perform a wellness check, a term we had learned just recently. I wasn't directly involved in any of this, as I was desperately trying to finish what brought us to Russia in the first place, finishing renovating our apartment in a 19th century building. This project had been in the making since 2021, when we had bought the place in the hope that it would become our home base for summers, convenient as we traveled to conferences in Europe and to accommodate my film historical research trips to Russia. To enjoy cooler weather, as New York is hot and musty, to see my family, and simply to have a home away from home, the one that we own and remodel to our needs, the kind of thing that was and continues to be unattainable in New York, where home ownership is out of our reach. We thought once it's finished, we'd write our best film history books there, while on break from the academic year's teaching. The project was well past all deadlines and all imaginable budgets. Little got done when I wasn't directly supervising it, and getting it renovated involved hiring a diverse cast of specialists skilled in crafts sliding into obscurity, such as lime plastering or repairing old wooden windows. People such as this aren't often good at industrial methods of production or meeting deadlines. With some of them, it helped that I was able to set priorities and schedules and thus get the work done faster. At times, I got hands-on more than I could ever have imagined. In the circumstances, I stayed away from the housing issues in New York as much as I could, trying to accelerate the process in St. Petersburg to the point where we would actually be able to move in and have the apartment be there for us rather than working for it full-time. Our money anxiety was real too, and subletting the New York apartment was crucial. So on June 3rd, I was busy with the window guys. One of them, Hamid, bought cherries to treat everyone, which was very nice and unexpected. Our electrics were mostly ready, and Dan was sitting on a chair in a corner with his laptop plugged into one of the recently installed power outlets. It must have been about 2 or 3 p.m. when I came to him, and he handed his laptop over to me, sobbing. He showed me an email from our neighbor informing that, unfortunately, Juliette had passed away. She was found inside our apartment. From that point on, I remember that Dan was on the phone with several people, a police detective, our building superintendent, and our neighbor. Later, we got outside, grabbed food, and then went for a walk. We were trying to process the situation and figure out how to think about it. We talked about how we were lucky to get to know Juliette even briefly. And while Dan was on the phone, I remember myself thinking 2 thoughts simultaneously. What becomes of your home when someone dies inside it? And then also, whatever I may think about this, it shouldn't matter much. The main focus should be on Juliette, how wonderful she was, and that she deserved passing away in dignity. Most of the older apartments, and our New York building was built in the mid-1950s, have someone who had died inside. Life goes on in them. We'll continue to live in it, and we won't be superstitious or squeamish, because any of that would be disrespectful towards Juliette and simply unwise. She deserved respect and dignity. Soon these thoughts had to yield to more urgent and mundane concerns, as we were only beginning to realize that the bureaucracy surrounding the process was more complicated than we could ever imagine. The police put a seal on our apartment door, a bright green sticker informing that any attempt to enter it was illegal. I don't remember who was the first to tell us that this could potentially be long and complicated. I was to give a talk in Moscow later that week, and so we boarded the train. Somehow I managed to put my talk together, although I was almost late to it. Dan was on the phone a lot. At our hotel room at night, in the middle of talking to each other, we were saying, "Juliette, please help us. Wherever you are right now, please say a word on our behalf. Hope you're all right over there." About a week later, we saw an obituary online mentioning that Juliette's death was caused by acute bacterial meningitis. We read all we could about the disease. Meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges, the protective membranes that cover the brain and spinal cord. When I was a child, my mother often told me I'd get meningitis if I don't wear a hat. Later in my life, my Boston friend was telling me about his mother's meningitis and how she never fully recovered from it. Meningitis can be viral or bacterial, and viral meningitis is far more common. Bacterial meningitis, while quite rare, is very deadly. It is crucial to administer the right kind of antibiotics as quickly as possible. If not, this may result in lifelong complications, disability, or death. Considering how rare it is, it seemed like some kind of force just came down and took Juliette away. Our understanding is that she received that diagnosis through a post-mortem examination. The police detective told Dan that, according to their estimate, Juliette had been dead for no more than 48 hours before she was discovered. Her dog was with her, alive. Jeff, Juliette's work partner, told us that his daughter happened to be familiar with the world of dog shelters and adoption. She got involved and didn't let the police place tire banks wherever they normally place the pets of people who died alone. Tyra was adopted into a family pretty much the next day. Much of the rest of our summer was consumed by the struggles trying to figure out how we could get our apartment back. I'll tell about those in my subsequent videos, but this one is about Juliette. In late October, we attended a memorial organized by Juliette's friends. By then, we had been in New York for 2 months, living in a temporary apartment provided by NYU, as we were still unable to access our own. It was a beautiful event with a reception and a harpist playing as the guests were gathering. About 30 minutes after the official start, we were invited to sit down in a compact lecture room. 2 large screens were projecting a slideshow compiled from photographs contributed by friends. Friends took turns speaking. 3 words came up the most in characterizing Juliette: beautiful, intelligent, and kind. Kind especially, and this was easy to imagine as we too had experienced this during that brief meeting in April. A few people mentioned the fights they had had with Juliette and how their relationship could be uneasy at times. Many were familiar with the story of her childhood and the abusive father who disappeared from the family's life when Juliette was about 8. She didn't miss him. Fear seemed to be the only emotion he could provoke in her. Decades later, she was terrorized to speak in public, still imagining that he could be somewhere in the crowd, still able to harm her. At some point, she hired an investigator to get some clarity about what came of her father. Turned out he had died in prison. This early trauma was not only psychological. Juliette and her mother came out of the situation impoverished, and on some occasions they experienced homelessness. Juliette changed many schools. Her relationship with her mother was very profound, and from the friends' accounts, I understood that her mother was a strong, bright, and compassionate person. Her passing a few years ago was devastating for Juliette, although she was recovering. One account that was especially striking was from a very young woman, I'll call her Laura, who said that Juliette was her godmother. Laura's own mother was 16 when she was born, and she was homeless. She approached Juliette, who must have been about 22 years old at the most at that time, and asked if she perhaps had a job for her. Juliette was able to help out. The two of them became friends. Occasionally, Juliette's mother would babysit Laura while the two young women went out dancing. Laura repeated a few times that Juliette had taught her mother how to be a woman through the joy of the things they did together as women. She couldn't stop crying as she was telling these stories. She still occasionally calls Juliette on the phone to listen to her voice on the answering machine, she said. She leaves her messages. She thanked whoever continued paying Juliette's phone bill. I don't think anyone has been paying it. It just continues to be billed automatically every month, as do other bills, since there is no one officially in the position to cancel this contract. Initially, we were not planning to speak. Who are we, after all? We only knew Juliette briefly. But the more stories we were hearing, the more evident it was becoming that the closest people in her life knew very little about her last couple of weeks. It seemed that our small contribution could matter. So we went to the microphone and talked about our meeting we had with Juliette in April, her last email, and how cathartic it was to listen to everyone's stories of her. We had some warm conversations afterwards. It is still not clear how much we'll be able to know about the circumstances of Juliette's death. At this point, her closest surviving relative is a cousin in Canada, found through efforts of one of the friends. That friend was also instrumental in helping the cousin submit the necessary paperwork to get Juliette's body released for cremation, sometime in late June or early July. It was getting really close to the deadline, and had they missed it, the city would have disposed of the body in one of the ways we imagine being the fate of the most misfortunate, anonymous, and invisible. Juliette wasn't any of that. But as we have come to learn, this outcome can become a reality for anyone who dies without a will and does not have blood relatives. About 2 weeks ago, a public administrator has been appointed to distribute Juliette's estate, pay her bills and debts, and hopefully also return our apartment back to us. Although the bureaucracy continues to be slow and is taking all the time it needs, so we don't know when this might happen. Our lawyer told us that the public administrator may request additional information from the hospital, and we might get a chance to know more about what exactly happened to Juliette. I'll end this episode here. Technically, this channel is about the bureaucratic nightmare we have been through trying to get back our apartment, but this story would be very incomplete without talking about Juliette, who has very much become a part of our life. In my next episode, I'm planning to talk chronologically about our struggle to navigate the system. Think NYPD, the Surrogate's court, the public administrator's office, and Dan's emergency trip to New York in the summer, sleeping on friends' couches while trying to connect the dots. He might join me in that video. If not, I'll narrate the story as I wrote it down from his words. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider liking this channel and subscribing to it. Stay well and see you next time.